Now that you have a solid Flutter and Dart foundation, it's important to make sure that you can also debug and fix your apps when things go wrong. Because when writing code, no matter which programming language you're using and no matter which kind of application you're building, things will eventually go wrong. And as a developer, you therefore must know how you can help yourself and how you can fix things. So in order to give you the tools you need to fix problems and errors you might be facing when building Flutter apps, we'll take a look at how you can read and understand error messages you might be getting when running your apps. We'll also take a look at the debug mode you can use for running your Flutter apps and what you can do in that mode. And we'll get started with the Flutter Dev Tools in this course section. Now for this course section, I took the finished project from the previous section and added 1 or 2 problems and bugs to it. And you find this updated project, this starting project for this section therefore, attached to this lecture. As mentioned, it's essentially the same project as before, but with some issues. So if you do have an emulator up and running, you can run this project without debugging, as we always did it throughout this course, and run it on your emulator on your virtual device. And if you start the app there, you will see that initially it seems to work as expected, but eventually you'll face this error here when you reach the results screen. And if you then restart the quiz thereafter, you will notice that if you reach the results screen again, you face another error, which now affects the overall screen. So this app clearly has some issues. And what can you do now to fix those issues? Now I want to start with fixing this first error here, which I get after going through all the questions, even if I'm just going through those questions the first time. And to fix this error and to get rid of this bug, I want to take a closer look at the error messages presented by Flutter, because those indeed very often help you analyze what's going wrong and help you find and fix the problem that is causing the error. Now here you can see that if things do go wrong and your app throws an error whilst running, you see that error message right here on the screen. And by the way, this of course is a feature that only exists during development. If you built the app for production and distributed it through the app stores, your users will not see those error messages. There, the app will very likely just crash. But during development, you see the error message right here on the screen, and this error message might sometimes already be all you need to find out what's causing this error. Here, for example, we learn that the error seems to be related to typecasting. And this already might be a good hint, because in this application that we have here, there is only one place where we are doing some typecasting. And that's in this summary item, where I'm casting some types to tell Dart that certain values in my map are of certain types. But the error message that's shown directly inside of the app might not always be enough to find out what's going wrong. And for that reason, it can be helpful to explore a more complete error output and dive into the error message in greater detail. And you can do that when using Visual Studio Code by opening the panel under View, Appearance, Panel, or by using the panel shortcut you see here. If you open that panel, you should go to the debug console here at the bottom, and it's inside of this debug console where you get more details about the error that was thrown. For example, here you see the error message, and it even tells you which widget was causing this error message or was related to this error message. And you also get a link to the file and even the line of code that caused the error, though if you click on this link here, you see that it in the end takes you to the questions summary widget, and there to the line where the summary item is used. Which makes sense because it's the summary item widget that was causing the error. But you can get more details about the error if you scroll up. And that's in general a good idea. When you get an error in your Flutter app, you can always open that debug console and there scroll up. You should at some point reach such a stack trace, so such a long list of involved method calls, but most of those calls will be internal calls by Flutter related to the code written by the Flutter team, and you can ignore those. But if you scroll to the top of this stack trace, you will find more information that's relevant to you. For example, here we get the error message again, and sometimes you don't have an error message here at the bottom. In that case, you should always scroll up to see the actual error message. And in addition to this error message, you also again learn which widget was related to the error. And, very important, you should get at least one line in that stack trace here that's highlighted. In this case, the first line, though it's not always necessarily the first line. And very often this highlighted line is the best entry point you can use to learn more about the error or to analyze what's causing this error. In this case, I for example see that it's the build method of the summary item widget that seems to be causing this error, and I even see a link to that file here, including the code line that seems to be causing the error. And if I click this link now, I am indeed taken to this summary item widget here. And I'm taken right to the code line, in my case here line 25, that seems to be causing this error. Now combined with the error message, the problem here seems to be that we're trying to cast something to int, so that we're trying to tell Dart that some value is of type int. That's what we're doing here with this piece of code, when the value actually is of type string. And Dart therefore complains here at runtime when executing the app that it can't treat a string as an integer, even if we wanted to. So the problem here seems to be that the value that we think is an int is actually a string. And this is a great starting point to dive deeper into this error and into this bug that seems to exist in this app. What is inside of item data question? Well, we can go to the results screen, which is where this map object here is constructed. And there we can take a look at the value that has this question key, because it is this question key we're accessing here. Now, if we take a look at that key, we can indeed confirm that there seems to be a string stored as a value for that key. So indeed here the problem simply is that we're accidentally accessing the wrong key. This here should be question index, because it's that question index key that contains an integer as a value. Now, because this map has a value type of object to accept different value types, Dart was not able to catch this error during development. It doesn't show any error here in the IDE when using the wrong key, because it simply doesn't store any specific type information about the values. Instead, it only knows that any kind of value is accepted here for those keys. But of course, at runtime, when this code here really executes, this crashes because question, as it turns out, stores a string and not an integer. So here the fix is to use question index instead, which is the correct key that does store an integer. And if we then force a reload and we go through all these questions again, you indeed see that now the error went away and we can see those results again. We also got no error message in the debug console anymore. And that's how you should treat error messages. Treat them as starting points to find out what's wrong. Take a look at the line of code in the code file that's causing the error and carefully read the error message. In this case, you learned that it was related to typecasting, and therefore it made a lot of sense to take a closer look at this line of code. Of course, you then still, in this case, had to find the error on your own, but the error message, of course, helped a lot with getting started with finding that error. Now, understanding error messages is a crucial skill, but it's not the only thing you should be able to do as a developer. And to show you another helpful feature that you can use for debugging your app and for finding error sources, I'll move on and restart this quiz, because as shown earlier, if I go through it again, I now get an error again suddenly. A different error this time, affecting the entire screen, and also a different error message, but still an error. So what's the problem here? Well, of course, you could and typically should also again take a look at the error message here, also in the debug console. This time there is no error message at the bottom, but as mentioned, if you scroll to the top of this stack trace, you find an error message here. And here we seem to have a problem with using an index in a list, most likely, where we try to use an index, 6 in this case, in a list where we only have indexes 0 to 5. So we seem to access a list item that simply doesn't exist. And of course, again, we learn which part of our code is related to this error. We see that it seems to be related to an array, which in the end is simply a list. But then we also learn that it seems to be stemming from the build method in the questions screen state class. And again, we can click this link to be taken to that code file and to that line of code to find out where this error is originating from. But of course, we could now think about this app again and manually go through all the code again. But instead, I want to show you another feature here. I want to show you how you can run your apps in debug mode and how you can use certain debugging features. Now, to use that debug mode, you first of all should stop the running app and then restart it, but this time by starting it with debugging, so by using the start debugging option. Alternatively, you can go to the main Dart file and there click on debug. This starts the app not just in development mode, but in debugging mode, which unlocks some extra features that make the app a bit slower, but help you as a developer with analyzing the app whilst it runs. So it's not the mode you should use as a default for running the app, since it will slow the app down, but it is a great mode for getting access to some extra features that can help with tracking down errors. So here the app started again, and you can use it as before, but now with debugging mode started, you can do one special thing. You can add breakpoints in your code. And you do that by going to one of your code files, here for example to the code file and to the line of code that was mentioned in the error message before. And if you then hover to the left of these line numbers, you see this red dot here. If you click on that red dot, you add a so-called breakpoint. And what does this breakpoint do? Well, let me answer a question and show you. As soon as this line of code where I added my breakpoint executes, app execution stops, and I moved back here to my editor, and I can now analyze my code and the values that are currently being used in this code. So the values that are currently stored in properties and variables, for example, at runtime. And app execution is paused, as you can see. It's frozen basically until I continue by clicking this play button here. And this all works despite the Dart code being compiled to machine code. Flutter does all the heavy lifting of linking the app execution on my device, which happens in machine code, back to my original source code. And that's this extra work that's being done by Flutter behind the scenes in debug mode. Now here I can, for example, hover over values, for example, the current question index property here, to see the value that's currently stored inside of that property. And I cannot just hover over current question index, but for example, also over questions. And I would see that this is a list with 6 items. And I even see the list indexes here. And I can even expand the individual items to see which values are stored inside of these items. And these features can, of course, give you very valuable insights into your app at specific points of time whilst the app is running. Now here in this case, I'll continue because currently the app is still working. But of course, now every time I'm answering a question, this gets paused and I can analyze the current values again. You can also right-click on a property or variable and add it to watch so that it is added here to the left in this watch window. And now you will always see this variable or property with its latest value without even hovering over it. So if I now continue and answer another question, I see the updated value here without even hovering over current question index. So this can be very convenient if you know that a specific value should be tracked and you want to quickly see what's inside of that value. Here, for example, I now see that I have an index of 5 and I do have 6 questions with the last question having an index of 5. So accessing this question should still work, but if the current question index would thereafter increase to 6, we would probably get an error. By the way, here you don't just see the watch window on the left, but you also have some generally available variables here. For example, this refers to the entire questions screen state object. And you could dive deeper into some internal properties here, many of those properties being managed by Flutter. And context is this extra object which I mentioned before, which we will use in the next section and which we can ignore for now. You also see the current call stack here, which simply allows you to find out which methods have all been called under the hood up to this point where this breakpoint was reached to get the app to where it is right now. But all that doesn't help us right now, so here I'll just continue. And I'll now go to the results screen and restart the quiz. Now it pauses again, and now we can indeed see that the current question index is reset to 0 here. So this seems to work correctly, so indeed the error seems not to be related to the current question index being too high, at least not right now. Here it was reset as expected. So we can continue a couple of times, and since I know that the error won't occur until I reach the results screen again, I'll also disable the breakpoint again by clicking on it again and by resuming, and then answering all those questions except for the last one, because I know that thereafter I'll get my error. Here I'll reintroduce my breakpoint and then click and answer, and now it pauses again, and here I now see that suddenly current question index is 6, even though it was reset before. And this is of course the reason for this error we're getting, because we only have 6 questions where the last question has an index of 5. So trying to access a question with the index 6 will simply fail because there is no such item in that list. And that's why we're getting this error, which we get thereafter. And if an error occurs, as it is the case here, it will actually automatically pause the app, even if there wouldn't be a breakpoint at the point of time where the error occurs. But of course, thus far we haven't learned anything new, or of course not too many new things. We just know that we got an index that is too high, but we need to find out why it is too high. And for that, we should take a look at the rest of this class here. There we can see that we're initializing the index here, and we're incrementing it whenever a question is answered. Indeed, there is no code in this entire class here that would ever reset the question index back to 0. We only do that when this class is instantiated for the first time. So the problem here indeed seems to be that we never leave this class, that we stay in this class. And that normally should not be the case. If we switch back here to the Explorer and then take a look at the Quiz Dart file, we of course can see that in there we normally should leave the questions screen and navigate to the results screen as soon as we have as many answers as we have questions. So it seems to be this navigation that's broken here, because the problem seems to be that we're staying on this questions screen for too long. We're staying on this screen until we reach a current question index that is too high. That's the problem, and so therefore the actual problem seems to be that we never leave this questions screen. And since this seems to be the problem, it probably makes most sense to restart this app and to again go back through that quiz once and then another time, almost to the point where we get this error, But now here, before we get this error, I want to add some breakpoints here in Quiz Dart. And I want to add a breakpoint here in choose answer, because that code is executed whenever we choose an answer. Here in questions screen, we are calling onSelectAnswer, which in the end is a function, which in the end is that function defined here in Quiz Dart. And I want to take a look at choose answer to find out if there is something wrong with this condition, which should normally take us away from the questions screen. In addition, I'll add a breakpoint in the build method here to find out which widget we're actually displaying, because it seems to be the questions screen in a situation where the questions screen shouldn't be visible anymore. And with that, I'll answer this last question. And now it pauses here in choose answer. And here we can of course also take a look at the various values we have here. For example, the answer that was selected, and then add selected answers. And here we can see a problem. We got a super long list of selected answers here. And keep in mind that we only had 6 questions, but here we have 11 answers already, and we're about to add another answer. Now, besides resuming, we can also just continue with code execution step by using this second button. So now we go through the different parts of this instruction and then to the next line of code. And this can be very useful for walking through your code at runtime step by step. Here I used this feature to finish adding this answer to selected answers, so that indeed thereafter I can confirm that we have 12 answers in there. And since we have only 6 questions, the problem indeed seems to be that we never reset the selected answers list. We never set it back to an empty list after answering all questions for the first time. And for that reason, this condition here will not be met, because here I'm comparing the length of selected answers, which is 12 in this case, to the length of questions, which is 6. Of course, this is not equal, and therefore, if I step over, we can see that we don't make it into this if block. The code in there was never highlighted, it was never executed, and instead, if I continue here, we see that the next main step thereafter basically is this error that's being thrown. So we can also see that we never reached this breakpoint here in the build method. This build method never re-executed, so the build method of the quiz state class. And this of course is a clear indicator that active screen, this state, was never set, because if it would have been set with set state, this build method should have executed before any error occurred. But that never happened, and we therefore now know with certainty that we never navigated away from the questions screen, that we indeed still are on that screen, and that the problem seems to be that this condition here was never met, because selected answers wasn't cleared. And indeed that here is the problem. Here in Restart Quiz, we're not setting selected answers back to an empty list when we actually should be doing that. Because here we're going back to the questions screen, we're restarting the quiz, but restarting the quiz also involves resetting the answers. If we're not resetting the answers, this condition here is never met, and we never make it to the results screen. We therefore stay on the questions screen, and there eventually we reach an index that is too high. That's the problem here, and using this debugging tool can make it a bit easier to find this problem and to fix this error. So here, for example, I now know that I could try adding selected answers equal an empty list here in the setState function call of the restart quiz method in the quiz state class. And with that added, we can try restarting the app with or without debugging. And now hopefully we should not be getting this error anymore, because now with help of the debugging tool, we were able to track down the error, or at least the potential error, and we hopefully were able to come up with a fix. So let's see if this works now. If I go through this quiz twice again, first time works as before, but what about the second time? This now also works, because indeed it looks like this was the problem here. And as you saw, the debugging mode can help you analyze your code at runtime, and it can therefore help you find and fix such errors. So error messages and debug mode can be very helpful when it comes to finding and fixing errors. But you also got one last tool at your disposal, which I also want to show you. And that would be the Flutter developer tools. Now, when using Visual Studio Code, you might sometimes be asked when starting your app whether you want to open those dev tools. And of course, you can open them by using this pop-up, but you can always open them by going to View, Command Palette, or by using this shortcut here in Visual Studio Code. And then here you can type Flutter DevTools and choose this Open DevTools option. And here you can then actually open different parts or different pages of those developer tools. But I personally recommend using this option here, Open DevTools in Web Browser. This opens the developer tools in a new browser window, and this window and these tools here are connected to your running app. And you got various pages here that help you analyze this app whilst it's running. For example, you got the logging page where you see various log messages and also potential error messages you might be getting. You got the network page that can help you with debugging network requests that are being sent by the app. And at the moment, we're not sending any network requests, but we'll do that later in the course. You can analyze your app size. You can analyze the app performance, though if that is what you want to do, as mentioned here, you should use profile mode by starting the app in profile mode by clicking this profile button here above the main function. Because in debug and also in the regular development run mode, there are too many helper tools going on behind the scenes by Flutter to help you with development, but those tools all slow down the app, and in profile mode there is less of that, and therefore it's this profile mode that could help you improve app performance and analyze how performant your app is. You also got a debugger here in case you don't want to use the debugging features built into Visual Studio Code, which I just showed you. But for this section here, I want to focus on this Flutter inspector, because this inspector can help you with analyzing and optimizing your layouts and inspecting your widgets. For that, you see your currently rendered widget tree here. And that's basically your UI, which you see here on the screen on the left, translated to a nested widget tree where you can see how those different widgets are related to each other. And this can be very useful for understanding what's going on your user interface and which widgets are actually involved in that user interface. But of course, you can also select those different widgets and learn a bit more about them. You always get a layout explorer here on the right where you can see the width and the height of a selected widget and its relation to its parent widget. And if you hover over a widget here in this widget tree, you also get a window that helps you dive into the actual widget object that's being rendered behind the scenes by Flutter. And you can, for example, explore its state or any other properties that are set on that object. And this is, of course, not just available for Material app, but for all your widgets. Now, when selecting a column or a row here, you even have an interactive preview here on the right, or an interactive layout explorer to be precise, on the right, where you can adjust the main and cross-axis alignment directly at runtime from inside those Flutter DevTools. You can, of course, always do that from inside your code by editing cross-axis alignment and main axis alignment in here. And if you then save your code changes, the UI would update automatically as well, as you saw throughout this course already. But you can do it in an even more convenient way by using these drop-downs here to quickly try out different settings and see how your user interface changes if you change those settings. For example, here you can see that the identifier of the row I selected here moves around if I switch between start, end, and center for my cross-axis alignment for this row. And you can do this for all your column and row widgets that you have here. And this can be very useful for quickly trying out different options and finding out why certain elements are positioned the way they are positioned. In addition, even for non-column and row widgets, you get this layout explorer here on the right, which helps you understand which width and height the selected item has and how it's related to its parent widget. And you have this widget details tree into which you can dive, where you can also, again, analyze the different properties and settings that are set on that widget. For example, for this text widget, the text that's added to it, the color that was chosen, the size that was automatically derived, and many other things as well. And these can all be very useful features for analyzing your UI. In addition, if you know that you want to analyze a specific widget, but you don't want to search for it manually in this typically quite long widget tree here, you can use this button to select a widget from inside the screen and to also see the widget that is currently selected. So here, if I know that it's actually this chosen answer here which I want to inspect, I can click on it after clicking on this button, and it will then be selected here in this widget tree, and I can then again use the details tree and the layout explorer. If I then want to select another item, I just have to click on this magnifying glass here at the bottom corner, and then I can select another item. So that's all very useful. I can always disable this mode, of course, if I'm done for the day. And in addition to that, I also got some other features here where I can, for example, see some guidelines to understand why things are positioned the way they are positioned and how they are related to each other. For example, why a certain item is centered or anything like that. I can show text baselines to make sure that all my text is aligned the way I want it to be aligned. And if I restart this app here, if I'm on a screen that contains an image, I can also use this last button here to highlight images that are basically too big. In this case, nothing changes because this image here isn't too big, but in other apps you might indeed get some hint here that an image is unnecessarily big because you're resizing it such that it's way smaller than the original image in the file, and in such cases you might want to decrease the image in the file as well so that you're not unnecessarily loading a too big image into memory. Well, and that's it for the dev tools. Definitely feel free to play around with them. Combined with the debug mode I showed you and the error messages that are shown by Flutter if things go wrong, you now do have a solid set of tools that should allow you to find, understand, and fix errors, and it should allow you to build exactly the apps and the app user interfaces that you want to build.